The town of Hollow Creek was a graveyard of ambition, buried somewhere between the rusted railway line and the faded blue spine of the Appalachians. It was a place where nothing ever happened, and yet where everything bad already had. Elias Kestrel had lived on its frayed edges for 50 years. 98 years old, his frame was a testament to the fact that bone can outlast iron, but not time. He moved with the slow, deliberate care of a man perpetually patrolling a minefield. His eyes, pale ice-chip blue, held the distant, oily sheen of the Pacific, where he had learned, as a young sergeant major in the U.S. Marines, how little human life actually cost, and consequently, how much a single life was worth. His mornings were ritual: coffee strong enough to scour rust, the reading of the obituaries, checking if death had finally misplaced his address, and the polishing of the Japanese officer's katana he'd carried off Okinawa, a weapon he only ever touched to remind himself that some wars were necessary. Tonight, the quiet was broken not by an external threat, but by the relentless, predictable sound of the quiet war next door. The trailer, Unit 14B, was only 30 feet away from Elias's screened porch. It belonged to Cain Darrow, a man 20 years younger than Elias's late son, but possessed of the kind of heavy, meaningless brutality that Elias had seen crush spirits faster than any artillery shell. Cain worked on a local rigging crew when he bothered to work at all, but mostly he just drank. And when he drank, he hit. He hit his wife, Alara. Elias had heard the screams dozens of times. He was a veteran of 2 wars, the one against Imperial Japan and the silent, grinding war against the ghosts of that conflict. He was an old man, and he knew the rules of Hollow Creek. You don't cross the threshold of another man's misery. But the old man was tired of rules that only protected cowards. At 10:47 p.m., the pattern changed. The usual shouted rage, the sound of a bear demanding honey, was replaced by the sound that cut clean through Elias's historical apathy. The sickening, wet crack of wood hitting flesh, followed by a sudden, absolute, sound-swallowing silence. That's new, Elias thought. His heart, which had survived decades of high blood pressure and cheap cigarettes, finally starting to beat with something other than dull rhythm. That wasn't a shove, that was a tool. He didn't move for a full minute, waiting for the expected eruption of sobbing or renewed shouting, but the silence remained, thick and complete, like a blanket pulled over a corpse. It was the deadliest sound in the world, the sound of something finished and someone broken. The samurai's sword stayed on the wall. Elias reached instead for his cane, not the flimsy aluminum thing the VA had given him, but the one he'd carved himself from a piece of hickory 10 years ago, heavy, lacquered, and bearing the scars of his own woodworking mistakes. It was merely a tool. Alara lay fetal on the grimy linoleum floor, her cheek pressed against the cold metal base of the kitchen table. The blood in her mouth tasted coppery and thick, mixing with the stale dust and the stench of cheap beer. She hadn't screamed after the hit. The air had simply been knocked out of her lungs, a vacuum cleaner of pain. Cain stood over her, breathing like a broken steam engine, the baseball bat, the heavy childhood Louisville slugger, dangling loosely from his hand. Don't move. Don't cry. Don't make it worse. Her entire life felt compressed into this tiny, miserable space. She was 24 and Cain was her entire horizon. She had tried to leave 3 times in the last year, but he always found her, always brought her back, promising to change, promising that she was the problem, and then the cycle would reset. Her gaze fixed on the only thing she truly owned, a small, chipped ceramic sparrow, sitting on the corner of the shelf. Her grandmother had given it to her. It was a stupid, meaningless thing, but it represented the possibility of flight, the possibility of a world that wasn't stained by the yellow light of their cramped trailer. Cain had once threatened to smash it. Laura had stood in front of the shelf for an hour, shaking, willing him to stop, and for some reason he had laughed and walked away. The sparrow stayed. As she struggled to draw a shallow breath, Cain moved. He didn't bend down to check on her, he simply raised the bat again, the act entirely casual, purely for punctuation. You ain't going nowhere. You hear me? You stay right here. This time, she didn't feel fear. She felt a cold, final clarity. If she stayed, she would die, and the last thing she would see would be the shadow of that bat. She tensed, ready to roll, to fight, to simply accept. Then there was a sound that made Kane freeze, his arm hovering in the air. It wasn't a siren, it wasn't a shout. It was a single authoritative thump against the thin metal wall of the trailer, followed by the metallic schlick of a lock being engaged. Then, immediately, the sharp crack of the door being forced open.
Kane Darrow was not afraid of police. He knew their response time to trailer park violence was measured in hours, not minutes. He was not afraid of neighbors. They were either too scared or too drunk. But he was profoundly, physically afraid of the man who now stood framed in the fractured doorway, the Rock. Elias Kestrel did not look like an avenging angel. He looked like Death's apprentice, shrunk into a threadbare cardigan, the hickory cane held out not as a crutch, but as a pointer, its rubber foot barely disturbing the filthy carpet. "You dropped something, Kane." Elias's voice was a low, dry rasp, like sandpaper on granite. It was the kind of voice you obeyed not because it was loud, but because you knew it had been responsible for worse silence. Kane's breath hitched. He wasn't thinking about Ilara anymore. He was thinking about the stories the town whispered about Kestrel, the time he took out a wild coyote with a shovel, the 4 men he allegedly killed in a bar fight in '68, the fact that no one had dared to cut the towering oak on his property for 40 years. "Get out of my house, old man," Kane managed, trying to inject alcohol-fueled menace into the command, but it came out hollow. He still held the bat. Elias took one slow, deliberate step inside, closing the distance just enough to make the air static. His blue eyes weren't looking at the bat. They were looking at the man holding it. "That's a fine piece of lumber you got there," Elias said, tilting his head just slightly. "Looks like a Louisville slugger. My company used to make sure those boys in the jungle didn't have to face anything heavier than a bamboo stick." He stopped, his gaze dropping to Ilara on the floor. He didn't ask if she was okay. He didn't look horrified or sympathetic. He just looked at the damage, calculating, efficient. "I imagine you think you're powerful, Kane. Hitting the woman while she's down. That's a good way to feel big when you're mostly small." Kane roared, a sound of frustrated impotency, and finally shifted the bat, ready to swing. This was the moment, the high, tense breaking point. But Elias didn't flinch. He didn't even move his cane. He just spoke a single devastating sentence, the memory of the Pacific Wars burning in his eyes. "The only difference between you and the enemy I fought, son, is that they had the decency to be armed, and I was armed too. Now drop the wood, or I will break your arm in a place where no doctor can fix it, and I will not regret it." It wasn't a threat of a beating. It was a promise of professional, permanent, unforgiving injury from a man who had earned the right to inflict it. The air pressure in the trailer seemed to change. Kane saw the pure, cold, clinical absence of hesitation in the old man's face. This wasn't anger. This was duty. Kane's hand shook. The bat slipped, clattering onto the linoleum. The sound was deafening. Elias never took his eyes off Kane. "Now stand outside by the porch. Don't make a sound. Wait there until the sun comes up or until I tell you to move. I will shoot you where you stand if you go near that woman again." Kane, humiliated and terrified, stumbled backward, pushing past Elias and stepping out into the cold night air. The lock had been broken, but the unspoken wall around Elias Kestrel was stronger than any deadbolt. Elias turned, finally looking down at Ilara. He saw the chipped sparrow on the shelf and the blood on the floor. He knelt, slowly, painfully, his old knees cracking like dry timber. "Can you walk, Ilara?" he asked, his voice now softened, a low hum of exhausted compassion. Ilara pushed herself up, staggering. She looked at the old man, her protector, whose face was still set in the hard lines of a man who had faced true demons. Where do I go?" she whispered, her voice barely a thread. "You go with me," he said simply, putting the tip of his cane beneath her arm for support. "You stay until this war is over." As Elias, Kestrel, and Ilara stepped out into the night, the silhouette of Cain Darrow, small and trembling, was visible against the porch light, paralyzed by an order from a man whose war was supposed to have ended 80 years ago. Elias knew this was only the first skirmish. Cain would call his friends. He would come back for revenge. Elias Kestrel had just dragged the war out of the jungle and onto his own lawn. He gripped Ilara's arm tighter, and together, the veteran and the victim walked towards the light of the old man's house, prepared for the coming siege.
Elias Kestrel's home was not comfortable. It was functional. Every object had a history. Every angle had a purpose. There were no frivolous knickknacks, only the heavy, polished wood of inherited furniture and the stark, framed photos of young, dead men in fatigues. Ilara sat on the edge of a worn sofa, shivering despite the thick wool blanket Elias had draped over her. The kitchen light, a single, harsh, fluorescent tube, made her bruises look purple and stark against the unnatural pallor of her skin. Elias did not coddle. He was efficient. "I was a medic's assistant for 6 months on Peleliu," he informed her, his hands gnarled and surprisingly steady, unwrapping a clean bandage. "We didn't have clean alcohol. Now we do." He worked in silence, cleaning the split in her lip, wrapping the ribs he suspected were cracked. His touch was impersonal, clinical, yet it carried the undeniable weight of protection. It was the first time in years she felt seen not as an object of rage, but as an objective to be protected. "Why did you do that?" Ilara whispered, the words catching in her swollen throat. "He's going to be back. He has people." Elias paused, his gaze fixed on her face, but his mind clearly elsewhere, on a map, a trench, a timeline. "He had already won his war against you, Ilara," Elias said, the truth hitting her like a cold slap. "He won because everyone let him. My job now is to make sure he knows he just started a new one, and this one he can't win." Ilara looked around the meticulous order of the room. The only messy thing was the cane leaning against the fireplace, its hickory shaft looking heavy and reliable. She noticed the framed citation on the mantelpiece, the Presidential Unit Citation for actions 78 years prior. He was a piece of history, and he had just inserted himself into her desperate present. "My ribs hurt," she whispered, the tears finally welling up. Tears not of fear, but of exhausted release. "Good," Elias responded, tying off the bandage with a precise knot. "Pain is a reminder you're still in the fight. Shame is what kills you. Cain left his shame on my porch tonight. He'll be back to reclaim it, and he'll bring friends to share the burden." Elias stood up, moving to the kitchen sink where he methodically cleaned the instruments. The clock on the wall chimed midnight. The ticking clock was now counting down to their inevitable showdown. Cain Darrow did not stay on the porch.
He stayed long enough for the paralyzing terror to wear off, replaced by a scalding, acidic rage that burned hotter than the whiskey in his veins. He had been belittled, disarmed, and ordered around like a dog by a man whose passport should have been expired decades ago. He stumbled to his truck and drove, not toward the authorities, he knew better, but toward the only two men in Hollow Creek desperate and stupid enough to follow his commands: Billy, the Blade Thorn, and his brother, Ray. They found them at the Last Chance, a dive bar on the outskirts where the law never ventured. Billy, lean and twitchy, was dealing pills. Ray, heavy and slow-witted, was watching the sports channel. "He put me on the porch," Kane slurred, slamming his fist onto the sticky table, ignoring the startled patrons. "The old man, Kestrel, he took her and he put me on his goddamn porch." Billy, counting a stack of rumpled cash, sneered. "The old World War II fossil? You let him do that? He probably smells like Bengay and death, Kane." "He threatened me," Kane hissed, his voice trembling with genuine humiliation. "He looked at me like I was a piece of trash he was going to sweep up. He broke the lock on my door. That's B&E. That's assault. And I want that whore and that old bastard paid back tonight. I want my wife back, and I want Kestrel to understand he should have stayed dead in the Pacific." Billy frowned. The old man was strange, but he was also old. There was no profit in tangling with him. "Look, Kane, we're dealing with the weekend shipment." "I pay you. I pay for your house, your habits," Kane interrupted, leaning in, his breath a foul weapon. "You owe me more than pills. You owe me respect. I get my wife back, and Kestrel gets a lesson he'll take to the grave. Tonight. We do it tonight. I'll make it worth your while." He didn't need to offer money. He needed to offer a target, a symbol. "The old man thinks he's a sheriff," Kane spat. "We show the town what happens to heroes who get too old." Billy, realizing this was less about Alara and more about restoring Kane's reputation, which meant ensuring Kane's steady income continued, finally nodded, a cold, predatory glint entering his eyes. "All right, Kane, we make a run. We hit the old man's house at first light. Ray and I check the perimeter now. Just a little peek. Make sure he ain't got some shotgun trap set up." The three men, the brute, the snake, and the muscle, rose, ready to reclaim the darkness of Hollow Creek. The quiet war had now officially recruited its first mercenaries.
In his living room, Elias Kestrel was not sleeping. He was mapping. He had never been a brilliant tactician. He was a master sergeant, an expert in defense, logistics, and holding ground. Give him a small piece of dirt and a mission to hold it, and he would turn it into a slaughterhouse. His house, his sanctuary, was now that piece of dirt. He ran his bony fingers over the glass table. The front is too open, poor field of fire. The rear faces the dense woods, a good avenue of approach for infiltration. His preparations were not the frantic setting of traps, but the meticulous establishment of sectors of fire. He moved the large, heavy dresser laboriously to block the large front window, leaving only a narrow strategic slit open, the height precisely adjusted for a man kneeling. He inspected his arsenal, not the ornate katana. That was a souvenir. His weapon was a pre-war Winchester Model 70 rifle, chambered in .30-06. It sat in its case, clean, oiled, and untouched. Beside it, the most crucial tool, a 12-gauge pump-action Mossberg, loaded with buckshot, lethal, close range, and devastatingly conclusive. He gave Alara his old radio, a relic from the early 1960s, a heavy box with a single red button. "You stay in the cellar, Alara," he instructed. The foundation is solid. If you hear anything other than my voice, you push this button until it breaks. It's connected to a relay I set up 50 years ago. It won't call the police. It will call an old friend I haven't spoken to since Korea. He runs a towing company in the next county. He'll understand. He'll understand the nature of a distress call that has nothing to do with the flat tire. His greatest defense, however, was psychological. He needed his attackers to know they were stepping into a war zone, not an old man's home. At 1:30 a.m., Elias heard the low, muted growl of a truck slowing down on the main road, followed by the crunch of heavy footsteps on the gravel path. Right on schedule. Reconnaissance. Elias moved to the kitchen window, obscured by the heavy lace curtains his late wife had insisted upon. He stood there unmoving until the footsteps stopped just beyond his perimeter of light. He knew they couldn't see him, but they would feel him. They would see the shadows, the meticulous clearing of brush around his home that offered no cover, the sheer obstinate stillness. He waited for them to get cold, for the alcohol to wear down the edges of their courage.
Billy and Ray stood among the dead weeds, separating Elias's lawn from the public road. Billy shivered, pulling his jacket tighter. The silence here was different from the silence in the bar. It was a weighted silence, like the atmosphere before a thunderstorm. "This is stupid, Ray," Billy muttered. "It's just an old house." "Yeah, but look at it," Ray said, pointing to the shadows. "The porch light is dead, but the one over the side door is burning bright. And there's those rocks. See how they're lined up? Ain't natural." Elias had, in fact, lined the perimeter of his property with large whitewashed creek stones, ostensibly a garden border. In reality, it was a trip hazard and a clear line of engagement. They were standing on the wrong side of it. Suddenly, a blinding burst of light struck them. Elias had flipped the switch on a powerful halogen work light he'd placed high in the eaves, illuminating their position like a stage. They squinted, caught flat-footed in the white glare. Then a voice, amplified by an old Marine-issue megaphone, split the night. It wasn't loud, but the amplification made it sound metallic and utterly without inflection, like a recording from the past. "You have crossed the perimeter of a hostile zone. You are in clear view. You are not hidden. You are not safe." The voice continued, slow, measured, and terrible. "You will inform Kane Darrow of the following terms. 1. He will not step onto this property again. 2. He will file for divorce in the morning and release the woman. 3. If he fails to comply, I will not call the police. I will not fight fair. I will use every tactic I learned 80 years ago to secure the zone, and I will begin with you too." The light didn't move. The old man was unseen, but everywhere. "Go home. Go now, and tell Kane the rock is waiting." Billy and Ray exchanged a panicked look. That was not the sound of a frail, angry old man. That was the sound of a commanding officer delivering a non-negotiable threat. They scrambled backward, stumbling over the creek stones, their bravado shattered. They drove back to Kane, shaking, delivering the terms of surrender. Kane, however, only heard the challenge. He was beyond reason. He called 2 more men, his eyes blazing with the same violent insanity that Elias had seen in the jungle so long ago. The threat had been issued. The line had been drawn, the siege had begun, and the morning would bring the main assault.
The pre-dawn light was the color of old cement, leaking slowly over Hollow Creek. Kane Darrow arrived with 5 men now, Billy and Ray and 2 new, anonymous brutes named Grizz and Dale, lured by Kane's promise of liquor and easy violence. Kane himself was operating on pure, toxic adrenaline, his mind a simplified circuit of hatred. Take her back. Break the old man. They pulled up in 2 beat-up pickups a quarter-mile down the road. They moved on foot, trying to use the thicket of sickly oaks for cover. Kane felt the ground shift beneath him immediately. The gravel crunch under their boots seemed impossibly loud in the still air. The old man heard us before we left the trucks. They approached Elias Kestrel's property, trying to sneak around the back near the woods, just as Elias had predicted. But the expected darkness was gone. Elias had set up motion-activated security lights aimed at the rear, bathing the avenue of approach in garish, blinding yellow. They were caught mid-stride, exposed. "Split up! Keep low!" Kane barked, his confidence already buckling. From the shielded slit in his front window, Elias Kestrel watched the enemy array. 5 men, disorganized, overconfident. He categorized them as he had categorized enemy infantry almost 80 years prior. The leader, Kane, predictable rage. The skirmisher, Billy, quickest to panic. The muscle, Ray, Grizz, and Dale, slow and dependent on orders. Elias lifted the Marine megaphone to his lips. He was not giving a warning this time. He was issuing an order to retreat under fire. "You have entered the kill zone," the amplified voice boomed, flat and cold, echoing off the surrounding hills. "This property is secured. You have 10 seconds to disengage. This is not a negotiation." Billy immediately dropped to his knees behind a trash bin, uselessly. The others froze. This was not a fight. It was an execution notice delivered by a ghost. Kane roared, frustration overriding strategy. "He's bluffing! He's 90! Go, Dale! Circle wide!" Dale, the smallest and newest recruit, tried to sprint along the shadowed fence line. That was the mistake. The pre-dawn light was the color of old cement, leaking slowly over Hollow Creek. Kane Darrow arrived with 5 men now, Billy and Ray and 2 new, anonymous brutes named Grizz and Dale, lured by Kane's promise of liquor and easy violence. Kane himself was operating on pure, toxic adrenaline, his mind a simplified circuit of hatred. Take her back. Break the old man. They pulled up in 2 beat-up pickups a quarter-mile down the road. They moved on foot, trying to use the thicket of sickly oaks for cover. Kane felt the ground shift beneath him immediately. The gravel crunch under their boots seemed impossibly loud in the still air. The old man heard us before we left the trucks. They approached Elias Kestrel's property, trying to sneak around the back near the woods, just as Elias had predicted. But the expected darkness was gone. Elias had set up motion-activated security lights aimed at the rear, bathing the avenue of approach in garish, blinding yellow. They were caught mid-stride, exposed. "Split up! Keep low!" Kane barked, his confidence already buckling. From the shielded slit in his front window, Elias Kestrel watched the enemy array. 5 men, disorganized, overconfident. He categorized them as he had categorized enemy infantry almost 80 years prior. The leader,
Cain, predictable rage. The skirmisher, Billy, quickest to panic. The muscle, Ray, Grizz, and Dale, slow and dependent on orders. Elias lifted the Marine megaphone to his lips. He was not giving a warning this time. He was issuing an order to retreat under fire. "You have entered the kill zone," the amplified voice boomed, flat and cold, echoing off the surrounding hills. "This property is secured. You have 10 seconds to disengage. This is not a negotiation." Billy immediately dropped to his knees behind a trash bin, uselessly. The others froze. This was not a fight. It was an execution notice delivered by a ghost. Cain roared, frustration overriding strategy. "He's bluffing! He's 90! Go, Dale! Circle wide!" Dale, the smallest and newest recruit, tried to sprint along the shadowed fence line. That was the mistake.
Elias did not believe in warning shots. A warning shot only tells the enemy you are afraid to commit. He lifted the Mossberg 500. He did not aim for Dale. He aimed for the precise patch of damp earth 2 inches in front of Dale's left foot. The resulting blast of the 12-gauge buckshot was deafening, a physical shock wave that blew a crater in the soil and sent a plume of dirt and gravel exploding into Dale's shin. The sound, amplified by the morning air, was colossal, the sound of history's heavy hand slamming down. Dale didn't fall from injury. He fell from pure, absolute terror, screaming as the gravel stung his flesh. The other men flattened themselves, instantly realizing the terrifying truth. This old man wasn't aiming to scare them. He was aiming to control them. He could have killed any one of them, but chose to demonstrate his surgical lethality. Inside the cellar, Ilara heard the gunshot, a concussive, final sound that swallowed all other noise. She squeezed the red button on the old radio, once, twice, 3 times, holding it down until her thumb ached. She did not cry. She knew that sound meant the fight had started and that Elias was holding the line. Outside, the situation stabilized into a terrifying stalemate. 5 able-bodied men were pinned down by a single, invisible nonagenarian. "He's got a rifle. He's pinned us," Billy whimpered from behind the bin. "It's buckshot, you idiot," Ray yelled. "He's making a point." Elias changed the sound, removing the megaphone. His natural voice, dry and weary, carried clearly over the silence. "Billy, you move left, you die. Ray, you move right, you die. I've held a line against men better than you with fewer bullets. You are surrounded by my shadows. You are standing on ground I have chosen. You cannot win." This was the core of Elias's strategy. The enemy must believe the terrain itself is his ally. Cain, lying prone behind the trunk of a fallen maple, felt his world shrink to the cold dirt and the sound of the old man's merciless voice. His hatred, however, was a bottomless well. "He can't shoot all of us," Cain yelled, his voice ragged. "Rush him, now!" Billy and the others hesitated. They had come for easy money and vengeance. They had found death and expertise. Cain realized his allies were useless. He made his final irrational decision. He rose up, dropping his useless pocket knife, and charged the house, a pure animal sprint aimed at the front porch.
Elias watched Cain charge the front door, his tactical mind assessing the trajectory. The rifle stayed down. This was no longer a military threat. This was a domestic threat made personal.
Elias stepped out onto the porch, leaving the heavy door ajar. He stood straight for the first time in months, the hickory cane held low. Kane skidded to a stop 5 feet away, seeing the old man in the full light for the first time. Frail in a cardigan, yet radiating an impossible danger. "You don't take what's mine!" Kane screamed, spittle flying. "You forfeited your claim when you chose violence over responsibility," Elias replied, his voice calm. "Now, stop." Kane lunged, a desperate, clumsy haymaker aimed for the old man's jaw. Elias moved, not with strength, but with efficiency. He did not duck, he parried. The hickory cane shot up, deflecting Kane's wrist with a sickening thud, stunning the nerves. As Kane roared in pain and recoiled, Elias brought the cane around low, tripping Kane's left leg. Kane went down hard on the driveway, the fall jarring the whiskey from his system. Before he could react, Elias had pressed the cane's tip hard into the soft, unprotected hollow beneath Kane's jaw, the pressure point that paralyzes with minimal effort. "Game over, son," Elias whispered, his face inches from the defeated man. "You do not get to live in the quiet war anymore." Just then, the sound of sirens wailed over the hills. Not the local police, but the heavy, grinding engine of a towing truck, followed by 2 marked sheriff's vehicles from the neighboring county. The towing company owner, Elias's old Korea friend, had understood the distress call perfectly. A veteran needed backup for a hostile engagement. The police found a tableau. 5 defeated thugs, 1 howling, 1 bleeding gravel, and 3 cowering, pinned down by the sheer psychological presence of an old man with a shotgun ready on a table, and Kane Darrow, paralyzed, with a cane pressed against his throat. Sheriff Morales, a quiet man who knew the history of the trailer park, looked at the scene, then at the single buckshot hole in the driveway. He looked at Elias, whose breathing was ragged, but whose eyes were clear. "Sergeant Kestrel," the sheriff said, carefully, "did you discharge your weapon?" "I discharged a single round in a controlled manner to secure the perimeter and neutralize a threat to a civilian under my protection," Elias stated, quoting military doctrine. "I then contained the primary aggressor. The remaining men are complicit in trespass and attempted assault." Morales simply nodded. He knew the difference between a criminal act and an act of war.
Kane Darrow and his associates were taken into custody. The evidence of Elias' injuries, combined with the multiple charges of trespass, reckless endangerment, Kane's initial rampage, and the clear threat to Elias, sealed their fate. Kane took a plea deal quickly, realizing the weight of an entire town, finally backed by a decorated veteran, was against him. He got 6 years and a permanent restraining order. He would never step foot in Hollow Creek again. Elias did not stay with Elias long. His work was done, but he didn't leave her to fate. He used his connections, the retired colonel who ran the towing company, the lawyer he knew from his late wife's estate, to secure her a small job and a cheap apartment 2 counties away. She was free. Years later, Elias Kestrel passed away peacefully in his sleep, his obituary a staggering testament to 2 wars and a quiet, dignified life. His house was purchased by a young family. As they cleared out the attic, they found a small, unmarked wooden box. Inside was a piece of cheap, cracked linoleum cut from the floor of the trailer at 14B, still bearing the faint, thick stain of blood. Beside it, neatly wrapped in an aged cloth, was his polished hickory cane. The young woman of the house, who knew the legend of the Rock, framed those two items together, the bloodied linoleum and the cane of command. She hung them in the town hall, not as relics of violence, but as a perpetual reminder of the night an old soldier chose to re-enlist in the service of a single, desperate life. Ilara, now a confident woman with a life of her own, returned to Hollow Creek years later for a visit. She stood before the display in the town hall. She realized the cane hadn't been a crutch or a weapon. It had been the line in the sand. She didn't need to speak to anyone. She knew the truth that the town had learned that night. Sometimes the strongest defense is not an army, but the unbreakable will of a single man who understands that true heroism is not about seeking conflict, but about being willing to finish it decisively when all others have failed to begin.